Hello, this is Michael Dowd, and this is the final part 5 of 5, in a series, a video discussion series called God in Big History. Each of the segments is roughly 30 minutes, 35 minutes long. This one is titled Evidential Prophets, and this is a beta version, so in July and August of 2014, I'm inviting criticism, feedback, suggestions for improvement on any aspect of this, and then I'll incorporate that and upload a final version in early September that can be used for church study groups or secular study groups. And just to recap where we've covered, the first session, the first program, was called The Big Picture, and we took a look at what big history is and why it's important, and how a big history view of God and religion differs from other approaches. The second segment we called Sacred Science, took a look at what big history reveals about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious or inspirational significance of science, and also how our sources of knowledge and wisdom have expanded through time. In the next session, number 3, which was titled Reality Rules, we took a look at what and where God is in big history and why it matters. The previous session was titled Sin and Death, and we took a look at how big history transforms our understanding of human nature and death and chaos too. And this final session will deal with how does a factual view of God and revelation clarify our way into the future and call forth boldly pro-science prophetic speech. The introduction to this whole series, I consider my TEDx talk that I delivered back in May, Reality Reconciles Science and Religion. So that's sort of meant as an introduction to this. Here's just a main point I want to make, that a factual view, an evidential view of God and revelation, in light of the trajectory of big history, clarifies our way into the future and restores the relevance, indeed the necessity, of unflinchingly bold, science-based prophetic speech. Now, as I've mentioned previously, I think session 2, I went into it a little in some depth. Big history's thresholds of complexity, or maybe it was session 1, I don't remember. But the thresholds of complexity in big history have been sort of the backbone or the structure or the skeleton of certainly the Big History Project, which is what Bill Gates and David Christian and Bob Bain and Craig Benjamin and so many, Cynthia Stokes-Brown, so many of the people involved in big history have collaborated with the Gates Foundation to create a free online big history course for high school students around the world. The way I've been speaking of these thresholds of complexity, actually not the identical thresholds, I've been talking about for the last 10 years the trajectory of cosmic, biological, and cultural evolution. I sometimes refer to it as nested emergence. That one of the fundamental truths that we now understand about the nature of reality is this nested nature of creativity. Subatomic particles are within atoms, within molecules, within cells, within organisms, within planets, within galaxies. In other words, at every nested level, every level can create. Every level can bring something new into existence that didn't exist before. I mean, stars are creative. They create the periodic table of elements. But molecules are also creative. Hydrogen and oxygen come together and water's created. So creativity exists in a nested sense. Now here, this image, I've got these nested all separated out. But you know, in reality, they're all nested inside of each other, and we're part of it. We're not separate from it. And God, or any divine name, is nothing less than a personification or a mythic personal name for that one and only creativity that includes everything else, yet also transcends everything else. Here's another way to image this, that what we find over time throughout the course of big history, or the epic of evolution, or the great story, we find greater complexity, greater interdependence, and greater cooperation at larger and wider scale, both in the pre-human world and also in the human world. Now, this trajectory is not debated. There's no scientist in the world that would say that, you know, theocracies came before ethnic tribes, or that insects came before nucleated cells. I mean, this trajectory is not in doubt. This is something that all the scientists of the world that I know of agree with. But it's also not teleology. This is not saying, I mean, people can have a teleological worldview, that's fine. But that's not what the evidence gives us. The evidence simply says that from the perspective of now, looking back, we don't have evidence that some super intelligence outside the system has pre-programmed it or is manipulating it and making it go this way. That's not what the evidence suggests. What the evidence simply suggests is that from the perspective of now looking back, we in fact see greater complexity, greater interdependence, and greater cooperation at larger and wider scale, and that we're part of that. We're not separate from it. This is an image, I'll just quickly go through the sequence, that we keep finding ways of cooperating at larger and wider scale by aligning the self-interest of the parts with the well-being of the whole. I showed this in volume 1 or 2, I forget which one it was, that we keep finding ways of cooperating, chaos keeps driving the process, and we find ways of self-organizing in such a way that the self-interest of the parts and the well-being of the whole is organized. So we now have this sense that gives us this grounding that human cooperation, for example, just to speak of humanity, once existed only within small family groups. Cooperative organizations have expanded to produce multifamily bands, then tribes, then agricultural villages, cities, and empires, then nation-states. And now some forms of economic and social cooperation span the globe. Now notice how different this creation story is from, say, some of the creation stories that make it sound like everything was perfect in the distant past, and then there's a fall, that everything's been downhill, it's all gotten worse since. This is a very different creation story. And this is what God, what reality has been revealing through science, through evidence. Now, how has this occurred? Well, we don't have to believe this. We now know how this has occurred. Wise governance is the key. That is, the impact of the parts on the whole must be reflected back to the parts. John Stewart's book, Evolution's Arrow, The Direction of Evolution and the Future of Humanity, goes into this at great length. And what he shows, and I think he's dead right on, many people, other people do as well, is that there is no human future. There's no viable human future without the aligning of self-interest of individuals, corporations, and nations with the well-being of the planet as a whole. I mean, until we honor big history as our common creation story and create laws and incentives that align the self-interest of people and organizations with the well-being of the body of life as a whole, we will continue to toxify the air, water, and soil, drive other species to extinction, and be hounded by religious, political, social, and economic crises. I mean, I don't think anything is more important than aligning the natural self-interest, the inevitable self-interest of individuals, corporations, and nation-states with the well-being of the planet as a whole. I mean, this is one of the things that we've discovered, is that self-interest is at all nested levels. I mean, Richard Dawkins wrote an amazing book called The Selfish Gene. And most people, many people who've never read the book, assume that what he meant is that because our genes are selfish, we're selfish. Well, no, that's not at all what he's saying. What he's saying is that self-interest goes down to the genetic level. And we need to now, this is the fundamental thing we need to do. We need to co-create, we need to structure our systems of governance such that individuals, corporations, and nations that pursue the well-being of the whole benefit. And the more good they do, the more they benefit. So they're incentivized to do as much good as possible. And individuals, corporations, and nations that disregard or harm the common good are taxed or penalized, or there's moral strictures, so that it's in their self-interest to do the right, just, ecological thing, and it's also in their self-interest to not do the unjust, unecological thing. I mean, this is the vital thing, because what this does is that it makes it so that the cheaper, easier, more convenient thing to do becomes the right thing to do. See, right now, the cheaper, easier, more convenient thing to do is usually the wrong thing to do. Amy Larkin, in her amazing book, Environmental Debt, comes at it from a very different angle, but yet comes to some of the same conclusions. She's got this three-part nature means business model, meaning no nature, no business. I mean, that the human economy is derivative, that the human economy is a subsidiary of the earth economy. There is no such thing as a human economy without the well-being of the planet. And she has 3 points, 3 core understandings that she's now working with business leaders and politicians all over the world. I highly recommend Environmental Debt. Fabulous book, very well written. But here are the 3 points. She said that pollution can no longer be free or subsidized. I mean, this is obvious, that we can no longer allow for the free or subsidized polluting of the commons. I mean, the fact that we've got a current governmental and economic structure where it's possible and it's profitable for an individual or corporation to get wealthy at the expense of the air, water, soil, and life upon which we all depend is collective insanity. It's absolutely crazy. So pollution can no longer be free or subsidized. That the long view must guide all decision-making and accounting. I mean, there's just no way that we can continue to survive as a species, much less thrive, by measuring progress, by measuring success by quarterly statements or even a year at a time. We have to take the long view. And then finally, government has a vital role to play in catalyzing clean energy technology while also preventing environmental destruction. And this third part is only necessary until we've successfully aligned this self-interest at multiple levels. Because once we've done that, then greed will actually drive us in the right direction. But until then, government absolutely, and of course government is necessary for that. That's why John Stewart in his book Evolution's Arrow has this model of what he calls vertical markets, where individuals and groups compete with each other to find ever more effective governmental strategies at all levels, from townships to, internationally, of aligning self-interest at multiple levels, so that if the part has a positive impact on the whole, it benefits, and if the part has a negative impact on the whole, it suffers, so that self-interest is aligned. So here Amy Larkin is coming at it from a different angle, but coming up with the same conclusions. Thomas Berry, my mentor, said it this way. I love it. All human activities, programs, policies, and institutions must henceforth be judged primarily by the extent to which they inhibit, ignore, or foster a mutually enhancing human-earth relationship. Carl Sagan spoke prophetically when he said, "Think of how many religions attempt to validate themselves with prophecy. Yet has there ever been a religion with the prophetic accuracy and reliability of science? No other human institution comes close." The climate crisis, I would argue, is unquestionably the greatest moral issue in human history. Now, this is not to put down or to lessen other significant moral issues throughout history. I mean, clearly slavery and the oppression of women and so many other things are really important. But if you didn't deal with slavery at that generation, you could deal with it in the next generation or the next generation. The climate crisis, we don't have the luxury of waiting another 20, 30, 40 years. We have to deal with this, and it's the greatest moral issue. It's not just an environmental issue. It's a moral issue. The AAAS, the most esteemed and recognized and largest scientific body in the world, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, just came out just a few months ago with an uncharacteristically prophetic What We Know campaign. If you just put AAAS What We Know, you'll find these videos, powerful short video clips. And one of the things that they point out is that based on scientific papers that have actually been published in the field over this period from 2001 to 2012, 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real, that humans are the main cause, and that we must take immediate action to prevent the worst catastrophes from raining, literally making it hell for our children and grandchildren and future generations of all species. Now, this is from 2001 to 2012. If you actually look at what's been published from November 2012 to December 2013, the actual peer-reviewed articles in scientific journals, 2,258 articles with 9,136 authors claim that it's real and human-caused. One article, one author in a peer-reviewed journal, it said that, it's not human-caused. Now, if you ask Americans, something like 40% of Americans think that the scientific community is divided on this issue. Why is that the case? Well, Merchants of Doubt. This is an incredible book, how a handful of scientists obscured the truth on issues from tobacco smoke to global warming. Some of the same PR companies and some of the same scientists for hire that confused the issue for 50 years. We now know, because we have internal documents, that the tobacco industry knew from 1962, I believe it was, without a question, that tobacco caused cancer and other serious problems. And yet they successfully confused the issue for 50 years because it was very profitable for them. Well, we don't have 50 years on climate change. We've got to basically put a price on carbon. We can't allow the free or subsidized polluting of the commons any longer. Notice this is just the last 62 years. Okay, it's actually getting worse. But here we can watch 62 years of global warming in 13 seconds. And again, the blue is on the colder side, yellow is warmer, and orange and red are the warmest. And notice how the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the global average since 1950. Okay. 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, 2012. And now it's getting worse. We are condemning our children and grandchildren to hell and high water. This is a moral issue. This is intergenerational evil. This is an intergenerational justice issue. Bill McKibben I consider to be a modern-day prophet. He says it's simple math. We can burn less than 565 more gigatons of carbon dioxide and stay below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Anything more than that risks catastrophe for life on Earth. The only problem? Fossil fuel corporations now have 2,795 gigatons in their reserves, 5 times the safe amount, and they're planning to burn it all, unless we rise up to stop them. Now again, when I use the word prophet, I'm not meaning somebody channeling an otherworldly entity. I'm not meaning somebody predicting the future. Prophets are those who see what's real, who sense what's emerging, and then speak a word of warning to the people that basically says, folks, we need to get right with reality or else. If we don't get right with what's inescapably real, we will perish. We will suffer the consequences. I believe that Bill McKibben and James Hansen and many others are modern-day prophets. Here, James Hansen, he's been one of the most respected scientists on the issue of climate change for decades. Here he is testifying before Congress. He's written many, many papers. Highly recommend his stuff. But now he's been arrested repeatedly. Now, why would one of the most prominent, respected scientists in the world on climate change repeatedly get arrested? I mean, look at this bottom picture. It's like, he's got a smile on his face. He's getting to know these guys. Well, why this level of activism? Well, he himself says why. It's his grandchildren. And I highly recommend this book, Storms of My Grandchildren by James Hansen, The Truth About the Coming Climate Catastrophe and Our Last Chance to Save Humanity. We do God, we do reality a terrible disservice if we think of the prophets as, these people 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, and we ignore the prophets of our time. In fact, Connie and I had our awakening to this whole movement by watching a TEDx talk by David Roberts called Climate Change is Simple. It's a remix. Somebody added music to it. But just put Climate Change is Simple and then in parentheses, remix, David Roberts, and watch that TEDx talk. It changed our lives, actually. Wendell Berry is someone who really gets our relationship to the necessity, the importance of having an honorable relationship to time and to nature and to mystery. He's got a wonderful quote. He says, "Nature is party to all our deals and decisions, and she has more votes, a longer memory, and a sterner sense of justice than we do." See, here he personifies nature in the feminine. Neil deGrasse Tyson, I love this quote. He says, "We are dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a rate the Earth hasn't seen since the great climate catastrophes of the past, the ones that led to mass extinctions. We just can't seem to break our addiction to the kinds of fuel that will bring back the climate last seen by the dinosaurs, a climate that will drown our coastal cities and wreak havoc on the environment and our ability to feed ourselves. All the while, the glorious sun pours immaculate, free energy down upon us, more than we will ever need. Why can't we summon the ingenuity and courage of the generations that came before us? The dinosaurs never saw that asteroid coming. What's our excuse?" And I've mentioned this before. Carl Sagan's Cosmos series was recently redone, a whole new version. Andrewian with Neil deGrasse Tyson put it together, and I just highly recommend going on to Amazon or wherever and order the Cosmos series, the new one that Neil deGrasse Tyson did. Session 11, Connie and I just rewatched it last night, Session 12. It's a 13-part series. The second to last one is on climate change, and it is fabulous. Highly recommend getting that. It's a must viewing, in my opinion. As is the new series that was done called The Years of Living Dangerously. Now, that won't be available on DVD. It was done on Showtime. But that'll be available on DVD beginning in September, I believe. The Years of Living Dangerously. Powerful, powerful television, specifically on this issue of climate. These are prophetic voices. So just a few resources on climate change, peak oil, and a response. Tom Friedman at the New York Times said, if you read only one book on climate change, make it The Great Disruption by Paul Gilding. The subtitle is Why the Climate Crisis Will Bring on the End of Shopping and the Birth of a New World. It's a very hopeful book, but not by shying away from the bad news. I mean, he takes a square look at the bad news. I've actually read the book once, and I've re-listened to it now 3 times. I love Paul Gilding's The Great Disruption. If you need a shot of hope in the face of some pretty scary stuff, get that book. High Tide on Main Street by John Englander. He's the former head of the Jacques Cousteau Society, and this is one of the only books, in fact, it is the only book that I've seen on climate change that no climate denialist even attempts to debate or argue with. It's compelling. And then on the issue of peak oil, there's a number of great books on it, but The End of Growth by Richard Heinberg is a fabulous book, and James Howard Kunstler's classic book, The Long Emergency. These are fabulous books. Moral Ground by Kathleen Dean Moore. It's an edited volume with essays from just dozens of significant thinkers. Also, there's a free study guide for that book for church study groups and others. 2052 by Jorgen Randers, who's a colleague and been collaborating with Paul Gilding. He's also one of the original authors of the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth. This is a fabulous book. My dear friend and mentor, David Gershon, his book, Social Change 2.0, in terms of how to transform social systems. I worked very closely with David for 5 years. This is a real great distillation of his current thinking, and he's been working with city governments and basically how to affect behavior change. I mean, how do you get people from the bottom up to genuinely change their habits? Habits don't change easily. We usually need peer support and accountability. And so that's David's book, Social Change 2.0. And I've mentioned before Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston's absolutely essential book, Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. That's Connie and I sell a number of books as we travel North America, and her book, Active Hope, is our top-selling book. Now, John Michael Greer is so amazing. I've just got to include him just by himself. He's my favorite writer, literally. The Long Descent and the Ecotechnic Future are sort of a pair. The Long Descent is that, people talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire. Well, the collapse happened, took 300 years. It was a stair step. Every decade was a little bit worse than the previous decade. So he talks about the Long Descent. But then his positive vision, the Ecotechnic Future. It could take 200, 300, 400 years to get there, but he thinks this is just like ecological succession. Many people assume that if you like Jim Kunstler or John Michael Greer, that, if you don't think of that things are just going to keep getting better and better, you're an apocalyptic person. No. John Michael Greer says there's 2 major inaccuracies that 80% of Americans are caught in. One is the myth of perpetual progress, and his counter to that is Not the Future We Ordered, Peak Oil, Psychology, and the Myth of Progress. That just little short paperback just destroys the myth of perpetual progress. But also, the other one is the myth of the apocalypse. Everything you know about 2012, Nostradamus, and the rapture is wrong. It's not about the end times. And some of his other amazing books, The Wealth of Nature, Economics as if Survival Mattered. This little paperback is the single best book on economics that I've ever read. Mystery Teachings from the Living Earth, which is really where he takes some of the mystery teachings, but interprets them in light of an ecological worldview. Green Wizardry, it's a very practical tool. And then Decline and Fall, his latest book, The End of Empire and the Future of Democracy in the 21st Century. And again, this sounds scary, but John Michael Greer writes with great heart, with real compassion. And like I say, I cannot recommend John Michael Greer too highly. His books are fabulous. Now, there's a cost. There is suffering that results from ignoring or dissing God's evidential revelation. I'm just going to quickly go through this. Youth are abandoning their parents' faith in record numbers. Now, obviously, this may not be, a suffering if you're a secular person, but for religious people that raise their kids, this is heartbreaking. The new atheists, these best-selling atheists, are mocking religion, and they're doing so by promoting Bible study. The highest rates of teen pregnancy, obesity, spouse abuse, and porn addiction are in the most Bible-believing parts of the United States. And evangelicals and fundamentalists are being left behind. They're in denial, or they dismiss God's factual word. For example, 77%, I recently read a survey, 77% of evangelicals deny a 13.8 billion year universe. 76% deny evolution, and 58% of evangelicals and fundamentalists deny climate change. Here are 5 painful questions. These are painful mostly if you're a religious person. Again, if you're a secular person, these won't necessarily be painful at all. But why is the most prosperous and Christian nation, filled with genuinely good people, betraying the future? Why is traditional religion shrinking in the West and secularism growing so rapidly? 1,000 young people a day are leaving the church in America, just in America. And when you ask why, the conflict with science is one of the main reasons. I mean, here, look, these are not Protestant, Catholic, but it's not just the liberals. This is the Southern Baptists. This is the Assemblies of God, same thing. The United Church of Christ. I pastored 3 United Church of Christ congregations over the course of a decade. They've had for over a decade now this campaign, God is still speaking, comma, and all this emphasis on the comma. Well, they need to be a lot more specific. I think they need to finish the sentence because they continued to shrink over the course of the last decade. The sentence needs to be finished. God is still speaking, and facts are God's native tongue. Evidence is modern-day scripture. And until we embrace that, we religious people, young people, are not going to find organized religion to be meaningful and life-giving. They're going to find it irrelevant. Why are some of the new atheists excitedly promoting Bible study? I mean, P.Z. Myers, one of the most widely read science bloggers, in fact, the most widely read science blogger in the world. Something like 50,000 people a day read P.Z. Myers' blog posts. And, you know, he's an out atheist. And here's a direct quote. He says, there's no surer way to make an atheist than to get them to actually read the Bible. How can he say that? Well, it's because these atheists, these best-selling atheists, Mike Earl, in his Bible Stories Your Parents Never Taught You. If you just put Bible Stories Your Parents Never Taught You into Google, you'll find, and it's all free online listening. Volume 1 is the Old Testament. Volume 2 is the New Testament. I've never known anybody to be able to listen to those and remain a biblical literalist. It rocks people out of literalism. You know, how can these new atheists, why is it that they're mocking religion by promoting Bible study? It's like, you know, the Bible used to be the solid rock of our faith. And now the church is shipwrecked on the so-called rock of biblical authority. And this is one of the reasons. These atheists, these best-selling atheists, are pointing out that if you take a crass, straightforward reading of the morality of the Old Testament, you'd have to conclude that it's basically obey the Lord or die. In the New Testament, it's believe in Jesus or fry. And yet, our own government, the United States Department of Defense, defines terrorism this way: the calculated use of violence or the threat of violence to inculcate fear, intended to coerce or intimidate others in the pursuit of goals that are generally religious, political, or ideological. Now, the good news is that God is not a cosmic terrorist. This is only caused because when we have an idolatrous view, an obsolete view of divine revelation, and think that divine revelation is locked up and frozen in time in these ancient texts, rather than all forms of evidence interpreted collectively. Why are rates of teen pregnancy, obesity, alcoholism, domestic violence, and porn addiction highest in the parts of America where the vast majority claim that they're saved from their sin? I mentioned before the response that I got from doing my TEDx talk in Grand Rapids 2 years ago, Why We Struggle Now, and that there were several evangelicals that told me that they now had to embrace evolution, but they just had to do it in a God-honoring way because they had never been exposed to this. I mean, I think the onus of responsibility is on those of us who do embrace a sacred understanding of evolution to find ever more holy or meaningful or inspiring ways to communicate to it. It's not a surprise to me that America, or that so many Christians in America aren't climbing over each other to embrace an evolutionary worldview, because we've not been showing the practical side and how much of our suffering as religious people is caused because we've been rejecting God's evidential word. And then finally, why have biblical literalists been on the wrong side of history regarding most factual and moral issues of the past 500 years? I mean, pick anything from slavery on, or Galileo with his telescope, the centrality. Why is this? Well, I think all 5 of these questions can be answered with the same cartoon. Onward, steed in search of truth. Bible tucked under the elbow, going the wrong way. This is one of the reasons why I encourage every priest, every rabbi, every minister, every imam to subscribe to Science News or something like it. But Science News is great. And meet together with the scientists and the science-oriented people of your congregation, or your faith community once a month or once a season or whatever, and let your science people help you interpret God's evidential word, so that you can inspire your congregation, not just based on ancient texts, but also current evidence. This, again, what I call the evidential Reformation. The Jesus Seminar, the 19th and 20th century, has had wonderful liberal scholarship that went a long way toward the deconstruction of idolatry of the written word, or biblical idolatry. But what we now need is the constructive work. That's not enough. We need to take it further. So here's where I'm going to get a little bit bold. I believe that we are in what will eventually be called the Great Reckoning. Humanity has been out of right relationship to reality, out of right relationship to God, and we're about to experience the consequences of that. And it's not because there's some supernatural being outside the universe that's pissed off at us. It's because we've been out of right relationship to reality, and there's a cost, there's a consequence to that. But I believe it will also become known as the Great Homecoming, the prodigal species waking up to our predicament after we've squandered our inheritance and coming back home to God. Obsolete, here's I'm going to say it pretty boldly, obsolete and impotent notions of God and God's word are killing us, shrinking the church, destroying the world, and condemning our children and grandchildren to hell on earth. Just when religion's moral guidance and righteous reverence for life has been most needed, it's been most absent. Why? Because the church has been blind and deaf to what God has been revealing for centuries, what reality has been revealing for centuries, largely because of what I call the triple idolatries: idolatry of the written word, idolatry of the otherworldly, and idolatry of beliefs. Now, before I'm misunderstood, by idolatry, I'm not meaning bowing down to wooden statues or whatever. I'm meaning having as our ultimate concern, our primary commitment, something that doesn't deserve to be, or that betrays and defiles the future. Idolatry of the written word, or you could say a magical view of ancient writings, is when you think God's best guidance, that is our best map of what's real and what's important, our best map of reality, is frozen in any ancient text. Idolatry of the otherworldly is when we think where God resides, where ultimate holiness, ultimate value, ultimate meaning resides, is outside time and nature. And idolatry of beliefs is when we think any one belief system is the only one right way to right relationship to reality. Good people are dangerous, and great people can engage in great evil when their map of reality is outdated, when they privilege ancient mythic revelation over current evidential revelation. I mean, it's kind of like, imagine you've got a GPS system that hasn't been updated since 1840. You've got a map of the Oregon Trail in there, and you're trying to go from St. Louis, Missouri to Portland, Oregon with an outdated map, radically outdated map. You're not going to get there. And yet tens of millions of religious people in America alone have a map of reality that's way outdated because they've been blind and deaf to God's evidential word. And so consequently, their understanding of what's important is going to be skewed. It's not a surprise that America isn't leading the world with regards to our response to climate, because I think it was 41% was the last poll that I read. 41% of Americans believe that these are the end times anyway. So why bother? See, there's no sense of commitment and responsibility for future generations if you think the end of the world is right around the corner. And what we know from history is that virtually every generation in Christian history thought theirs was the last or among the last. And what we can be sure of is they die and their kids believe that. And then they die and their kids believe that. End times thinking is an abomination. Thomas Berry, again, I started this whole series with this quote: "We are talking only to ourselves. We are not talking to the rivers. We are not listening to the wind and the climate. Most of the disasters that are happening now are a consequence of that spiritual autism." So I believe it's legitimate, and in fact, it's important, if you're in a religious context, to say, what's God saying to us today? Thus saith the Lord. In other words, if we give voice to what reality is telling us through the evidence, what can we say confidently? And again, I'm not predicting the future. I'm not channeling an otherworldly entity. I'm saying this is what reality, I'm arguing, I'm suggesting. You'll decide whether you think I'm accurate. But I'm saying this is what reality is telling us today. Facts are my native tongue. Honor evidence as scripture. Repent of your idolatries or face hell and high water. Nature is my secular name. Obey my laws or perish. Abandon apocalyptic thinking. It is an abomination. Again, I mentioned John Michael Greer's amazing little book, Apocalypse Not. Well, the Canadian television, just Brian Paisley came out with I think a 4 or 5 part series called Apocalypse When, and he covers the exact same kind of stuff that John Michael Greer does. Both of them independent of each other. Neither one of them knew about each other's work, but they both chronicle the 3,200-year history of end times thinking and the suffering and the tragedies that have resulted from end times thinking. It truly is an abomination. Purge plutocracy, that is where money rules government, and end corporate personhood. And then stop polluting the commons. Tax carbon now. We have to put a fair price on carbon pollution. In fact, these websites, carbontax.org, citizensclimatelobby.org, and energyandenterprise.com are the 3 best resources because, all of us can do little things, change our light bulbs and drive less and fly less. All that's cool. But the most important thing we need to do systemically, and we need to do it really soon, is to tax carbon, to put a price on carbon. And nobody says this more powerfully than Bob Inglis at Energy and Enterprise. Now, he's a Republican. He's conservative. And he just said it just so succinctly. He said, I favor a conservative approach that marshals the power of the market and doesn't increase the size of government. Here it is in a nutshell. Put all the costs in all the fuels and eliminate all the subsidies. And then watch the free enterprise system solve the energy and climate problem. He nails it. And again, the websites, carbontax.org, citizensclimatelobby.org, and Energy and Enterprise. I encourage you to go to one or more of those, follow your heart, and participate because you want to be able, in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you want to be able to look young people in the eye after we've done this and say, yeah, I helped make that possible. I helped make that happen. Now, the good news, the gospel according to science, the good news of right relationship, well, I can do a whole program on this, but the good news around climate change, I can say it in 5 words. We can see it coming. For the first time in Earth history, a species could see a potential extinction level event coming in time to ward off the worst and to prepare for what we can no longer avoid. I want to sort of wind this down, talking about the realizing or the factualizing of mythic archetypes, such as the return of the Lord or the second coming of Christ. Now, liberals often don't even know what to do with this language, and fundamentalists interpret it like a, Superman, a magical man coming down on the clouds. I suggest to you, this concept, the return of the Lord or the second coming of Christ, can be realized or factualized. It doesn't require us thinking of it in an otherworldly sense. And, for example, many of you, I'm sure, or virtually everybody has heard of the Granite Mountain hotshots. These were the 19 firefighters that died in the Yarnell fire just over a year ago. And what a lot of people don't know is that exactly a week before they died, they protected the champion alligator juniper tree, a 2,000-year-old alligator juniper tree. They protected. A fire was sweeping through. They protected the tree, and then exactly a week later, they died. And Connie, my wife, led a pilgrimage to this tree, and we read the names of the firefighters. And there was a woman that's been coming to this tree since she was 30. She's now 70, and she took this photo. And she had asked me to put my arm in this crevice. And while I was doing that, I realized that here I am with my arm in this 2,000-year-old tree. And I imagine this tree holding Jesus' hand in one hand and holding my hand in another. This one living being bridged all that time. And so the return of Christ isn't the magical return of a supernatural superhero. The return of Christ, the second coming of Christ, is not an unnatural event. It's an undeniable event. It's the undeniably true understanding that God is here right now. God is incarnate. The ultimate value is incarnate in time and nature as much as God was incarnate in Jesus. And getting that, realizing that God's speaking to us never more clearly than right now through all forms of evidence, is a profound and radical shift. This is something we can all participate in. Gil Bailie, an amazing writer in himself, I used this quote in my first book, Earth Spirit, back in 1990. He said, "It was not those closest to the historical Jesus who first gave the gospel its geographical breadth and theological depth. It was Paul, who had never known him. In addition, impressive achievements in biblical scholarship have given us a richer understanding of the early Christian movement than was available to the Gentile Christians of the 2nd century. If the life and death of Jesus is historically central, then people living 100,000 years from now will be in a better position to appreciate that than we are. Furthermore, when they look back, they will surely think of us as early Christians, living as we do a scant 2 millennia from the mysterious events in question. They will be right, for the Christian movement today is still in the elementary stages of working out for itself and the world the implications of the gospel. There isn't the slightest doubt that the greatest and boldest creedal assertions are in the future, not the past. It may only be at rare moments that this flawed and unlikely thing that we call the church even remotely resembles something worthy of its calling, but it is nonetheless embarked on a great Christological adventure. Even against its own institutional resistances, it is continually finding deeper, more realistic, and ever more inspiring interpretations of the Jesus event." I want to conclude on a positive note. Carl Sagan said, "How is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded, this is better than we thought. The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, subtler, more elegant. God must be even greater than we dreamed." He goes on to say, "A religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later," he suggests, "such a religion will emerge." And I believe he was right in the intuition, but wrong in the detail, because it's not a religion like any other religion. It's a meta-religious. A worldwide meta-religious movement has been emerging for decades, largely unnoticed, at the nexus, the intersection of science, inspiration, and sustainability. Beliefs are secondary. What unites us is a pool of common values, priorities, and commitments regarding living in right relationship to reality and working together in service of a just and thriving future for all. Again, this is what I'm calling Religion 3.0, the Evidential Reformation. And the 6 points, as I shared, I think, in the first program, that unites tens of millions of us, that reality is our God, evidence is our scripture, big history is our creation story, ecology is our theology, integrity, that is the practices of living in right relationship to reality, is our salvation, and ensuring a just and healthy future is our mission. Now, clearly, secular people won't use this kind of religious language. They might say reality is my ultimate commitment, my ultimate concern. Evidence is the main way reality is revealing itself to us, and so on. Religious people may, depending upon how deeply tied or conservative they are, they might even not feel comfortable with this language exactly as it is either. But here's a way of framing it, that whatever we mean by the word God has got to include reality. Whatever we mean by scripture or divine revelation, it's got to include evidence. Whatever we mean by theology or Genesis, whatever we mean by Genesis or our creation story, our sacred story, it's got to include big history. Whatever we mean by theology has got to include ecology, and so on. And I'm not the only one saying this. Paul Hawken, in his New York Times bestselling book, Blessed Unrest, How the Largest Social Movement in History is Restoring Grace, Justice, and Beauty to the World. I actually like the subtitle of the hardcover even better. He says, How the Largest Movement in the World Came into Being and Why No One Saw It Coming. Several other books that deal with this sense of living in right relationship to reality and ensuring a just and healthy future as sort of the 2 commandments of Religion 3.0. Larry Rasmussen's award-winning book, Earth Honoring Faith, fabulous book. I just interviewed him for the Future is Calling Us to Greatness series just earlier today, actually. Bron Taylor's amazing book, Dark Green Religion. It's on nature, spirituality, and planetary future. And again, he's showing how earth-honoring faith, nature-honoring spirituality is emerging and being integrated into all religious traditions as well as outside organized religion. And one of the most hopeful and inspiring books I've ever read, The Impossible Will Take a Little While by Paul Loeb. Wonderful essays. So just to recap, Part 1, We covered what big history is and why it's important, and how a big history view of God and religion differs from other approaches. That was the first video segment, and it was titled The Big Picture. Number 2, titled Sacred Science, what big history reveals about the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious or inspirational significance of science, and how our sources of knowledge and wisdom have expanded through time. Volume 3, Session 3, was titled Reality Rules, and covered what and where God is in big history and why it matters. Number 4, titled Sin and Death, how a big history view transforms our understanding of human nature and death. And then finally, how a factual view of God and revelation clarifies our way into the future and calls forth boldly pro-science, prophetic speech. I want to leave you with this sentiment, this sense that the past is rooting for us. I mean, countless generations struggled and suffered, and they made our moment possible. So to honor their contributions is to be of service to the future. So the past is rooting for us. And the sense that the future is calling us to greatness. When we live our lives, again, this is practical truth. This is not factual truth. This is practical truth. But when we act as if the past is rooting for us and the future is calling us to greatness, the fruit of our lives is wonderful, as a blessing. Because good, bad, great, and evil, these concepts, good, bad, great, and evil, have always, in all cultures, been defined by how we impact others and how that ripples out to the future. If I do something good, or if I'm a contribution to you or to the future, I've done a good thing. If I harm others or harm the future, I've done a bad thing. If I sacrifice in order to be a blessing to others of the future, I've done a heroic thing or a great thing. But if I self-centeredly serve my own needs, screw others to hell with the future, I've done an evil thing. This is not moral rocket science. We don't need 10 commandments to tell us this. This has been revealed in our hearts and through evidence. So the future is calling us to greatness. No matter what our attempts to inform, it is our ability to inspire that will turn the tides. Now, I'm almost 6'1". I'm 6 foot and about a half inch. These guys are tall. The guy on the left is John Mather. He's NASA's senior astrophysicist. He's the 2006 Nobel Prize winner in physics. The guy on the right is Craig Mello. He's the 2006 Nobel Prize winner in medicine and physiology. The reason that they invited me to the Library of Congress was that they both read my book, and they were doing a program together there called The Origins and Evolution of Life in the Universe. And Craig sent me an email. He said, Michael, you got to come to the Library of Congress and get your picture taken with us. He said, it'll be great for your book. You bet. I got there. Here's what they said about my book. John Mather said, the universe took 13.7 billion years to produce this amazing book. I hardly recommend it. Well, as an author, it just doesn't get any better than that. And Craig Mello said, the science versus religion debate is over. A must-read for all, including scientists. Now, this never did get me on Oprah, but I did have a meeting recently with the vice president and the executive producer of the Oprah Network about the possibility of creating a show called Soulful Science. So we'll see if that happens or not. But we did create an 80-second book trailer, and I wanted to conclude with this. I'll give Carl Sagan the final word. Science is, at least in part, informed worship. Now again, this is the beta version, so I'm open to any and all suggestions for improvement. If you're working with groups, here are some questions that I created that may be useful. Again, I'm open to suggestions for how to improve these. Please contact me. And then when the final version is up in September, I'm also available to respond to questions and comments raised by this video series via Skype, conference call, or speakerphone, and there's my contact information.